It didn't begin with a scandal, it began with a demand. A direct, uncompromising request that reportedly bypassed every layer of royal protocol and landed squarely at the desk of King Charles III himself. Zara Tindall wasn't asking for attention. She was demanding answers. And what she was asking about her children's security has now sent quiet shockwaves through the very heart of the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What makes this moment so striking is not just the request itself, but the way it was made firm, direct, and, according to those familiar with the internal workings of the palace, impossible to ignore. Reports suggest that Zara chose to step outside the usual channels, declining to filter her concerns through aides or private secretaries, instead pushing for a personal audience with the king, a move that insiders quietly describe as both bold and deeply revealing. Because within the rigid framework of royal protocol, such a decision is never accidental. It signals urgency, it signals frustration, and perhaps most significantly, it signals a growing sense that something, somewhere, is no longer working as it should. At the center of it all lies a question that cuts deeper than procedure, one that touches on protection, priority, and the silent hierarchy that governs royal life. Security, within this world, is not merely about safety, it is about status, about role, about one's place within the ever-evolving structure of the monarchy. And for Zara, a figure who exists both inside and outside that structure, royal by birth, yet removed from official duties, the lines may have begun to blur in ways that could no longer be ignored. Insiders whisper that recent internal adjustments may have quietly reshaped how protection is allocated, raising uncomfortable questions about consistency and fairness, particularly among the younger generation of royals. Why now? Why escalate at this precise moment? Some suggest that this was not a sudden reaction, but the culmination of weeks, perhaps even months of quiet concern, carefully observed and ultimately deemed too significant to leave unaddressed. Others point to subtle shifts within the institution itself, changes that may have created an environment where certain decisions felt increasingly out of balance. And then, there are the whispers, faint but persistent, hinting that not all royal grandchildren are being shielded in the same way, that behind the carefully maintained image of unity, there may exist a more complicated reality. It is a possibility that transforms this from a private concern into something far more consequential, something that touches on the very principles the monarchy claims to uphold. Because when a member of the family steps forward, not publicly, not dramatically, but firmly and directly, it forces a pause. It forces attention. And above all, it forces the question that no one within those walls can easily dismiss. If one voice has reached this point, how many others have remained silent? But this wasn't just a mother seeking reassurance. It was the beginning of a deeper question about who is truly protected within the royal fold. For decades, royal protection has operated under a strict and often opaque system, one that insiders claim is as much about hierarchy as it is about safety. But now, that system is being quietly questioned from within. Implications could be far more explosive than anyone expected. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes that security inside the monarchy is never just about risk, it is about rank, role, and relevance. Those closest to the inner workings often suggest that protection is carefully calibrated, not only by perceived threat but by institutional importance, a silent equation that determines who is shielded, who is watched, and, more importantly, who is quietly deprioritized. At the top of this structure stand the working royals, figures whose daily duties place them in the public eye and, therefore, within the highest tier of protection. Their movements are monitored, their environments controlled, their presence reinforced by layers of visible and invisible security. But beyond that inner circle exists a far more complicated space, one occupied by individuals like Zara Tindall, whose connection to the crown is undeniable, yet whose role within its machinery remains undefined. She is royal by blood, raised within its traditions, bound to its legacy, yet not formally part of its operational structure. And it is precisely this position, both inside and outside, that may have placed her in a uniquely vulnerable situation. Because when the system adjusts, as insiders now suggest it has, those on the edges often feel the shift first. Reports have begun to surface, carefully worded and cautiously shared, indicating that recent changes may have quietly altered how security resources are distributed. Some suggest a tightening of priorities, others hint at a redistribution that favors certain roles over others. There is no official confirmation, of course, only fragments whispers that speak of increased protection in some areas and noticeable reductions in others. And while these adjustments may appear procedural on the surface, their impact can be deeply personal. For a mother, even the slightest uncertainty is enough to raise concern. And when those concerns are left unresolved, they have a way of building, slowly but steadily, until they demand to be heard. What makes this moment particularly unsettling is not just the possibility of change, but the perception of imbalance it creates. Because within a family that presents itself as unified, any suggestion of uneven treatment carries weight. It raises questions that are difficult to answer and even harder to ignore. Are all members being protected equally? Are decisions being made based on necessity or something else entirely? Those familiar with the broader dynamics of the royal household suggest that such questions rarely emerge without cause. They are usually the result of patterns, of observations made over time, of subtle differences that gradually become impossible to overlook. And now, with Zara's request bringing these concerns into sharper focus, the system itself is being quietly re-examined, not from the outside, but from within. It is a shift that carries its own kind of tension, because once a structure is questioned, it can never return to being unquestioned. The balance, once disturbed, must either be restored or redefined. And in a monarchy built on tradition, even the smallest recalibration can ripple far beyond its original intent. Because this is no longer just about policy, it is about trust, about assurance, about the unspoken promise that those within the fold are equally protected under its weight. And as that promise begins to feel uncertain, the focus inevitably moves toward the moment when everything may have changed, the point where quiet concern transformed into undeniable action. And as the structure itself comes into question, attention turns to the moment everything may have shifted. According to Palace Whispers, this wasn't a sudden decision, it was the result of something that had been building quietly behind closed doors. A moment, or perhaps a series of moments, that forced Zara Tindall to act. Those familiar with the rhythms of royal life often suggest that decisions like this rarely emerge without warning. They form slowly, shaped by small concerns that refuse to fade. And in this case, the concerns appear to center on something deeply personal: her children, and the sense that their safety may not have been as secure as it should be. Reports, carefully phrased and never fully confirmed, point to a recent incident, or perhaps a perceived risk, that shifted everything. It may not have been dramatic in isolation, but it was enough. Enough to disrupt the quiet trust that underpins the system. Enough to turn unease into urgency. Because when it comes to family, even uncertainty can feel like a threat. There are suggestions that increased public visibility played a role, that growing attention, whether from media, public appearances, or simply the evolving spotlight around the next generation, began to expose vulnerabilities that had previously gone unnoticed. Insiders whisper that moments once considered routine began to feel different, that patterns started to emerge, subtle but persistent, hinting at gaps where there should have been none. These were not dramatic failures, not the kind that make headlines, but something quieter, something harder to define: a delay here, a reduced presence there, a shift that only becomes visible when viewed over time. And it is in these quiet inconsistencies that doubt begins to grow. Because within a system designed to project certainty, even the smallest hesitation can feel significant. What makes this situation even more compelling is the suggestion that these concerns were not new. Those close to the inner circle indicate that Zara may have been raising questions privately for some time, choosing discretion over confrontation, trusting that the system would respond as it always had. But when responses fail to come, or arrive without clarity, trust begins to erode. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, until what was once a steady foundation starts to feel uncertain. And that uncertainty, left unaddressed, transforms into something far more difficult to contain: frustration. Not loud, not visible, but steady, building beneath the surface, waiting. It is this quiet buildup that gives the situation its weight. Because by the time a decision like this is made, by the time a direct approach to King Charles III becomes the chosen path, it is rarely about a single issue. It is about accumulation. About moments that did not align, answers that did not satisfy, and a growing sense that the usual channels were no longer enough. The final step, then, was not impulsive. It was deliberate. A calculated decision to move beyond protocol and speak directly to the one person capable of addressing the issue at its core. And that choice, more than anything else, reveals the depth of the concern. Because within the royal structure, escalation is never taken lightly. It carries meaning. It signals that something has reached a point where it can no longer remain contained. And yet, even as this decision unfolds, it introduces a new layer of tension, one that extends beyond the initial concern itself. Because taking such a step does not simply resolve an issue, it reshapes it. It draws attention, invites scrutiny, and, perhaps most importantly, disrupts the carefully maintained balance within the institution. What was once private becomes part of a larger conversation, one that others within the system cannot ignore. And that is where the real complexity begins. Because within palace walls, actions carry consequences far beyond their immediate intent. Every move is observed, interpreted, and remembered. And when those moves challenge the established order, they resonate in ways that are both immediate and lasting. But taking concerns directly to the monarch is no small step, and within palace walls, such a move rarely goes unnoticed. When the request reached the palace, it reportedly triggered more than concern. It sparked a quiet but intense internal reaction. Because in a system built on order and protocol, a direct appeal like this changes everything. Those familiar with the inner workings suggest that the moment the message landed, it did not pass quietly through the usual channels. Instead, it disrupted them. Senior aides, accustomed to carefully managed communication and controlled escalation, were reportedly caught off guard, not necessarily by the concern itself, but by the way it had been delivered. Direct, unfiltered, impossible to reframe. And within a structure that depends on process as much as it does on discretion, that kind of approach carries weight far beyond the words themselves. It forces attention. It demands response. And perhaps most critically, it introduces uncertainty into a system that relies on predictability. Insiders whisper that what followed was a series of internal discussions, described not as chaotic, but as urgent yet controlled, a careful balancing act between addressing the issue and maintaining the appearance of stability. Because within the palace, perception matters just as much as action. Every response must be measured, every decision considered not only for its immediate impact, but for the precedent it may set. And that is where the tension begins to deepen. Because if one member of the royal family can bypass established protocol to seek answers directly from King Charles III, what happens if others begin to do the same? It is a question that does not require an answer to be unsettling. The mere possibility is enough. Enough to shift conversations, enough to raise concerns that extend far beyond the original request. At the heart of these discussions lies a growing divide, one that has been quietly forming over time. On one side stands tradition, a system built on hierarchy, procedure, and the belief that order must be preserved at all costs. On the other side, a changing reality, where personal concerns, public scrutiny, and evolving expectations are beginning to challenge that structure in ways that cannot be easily dismissed. It is not a loud conflict, not one marked by open disagreement, but something far more complex, a subtle friction. A difference in perspective that influences how situations like this are interpreted and addressed. Some within the institution may see the request as justified, even necessary. Others may view it as a disruption, a break from the very principles that hold the system together. And between these perspectives lies the challenge: how to respond without reinforcing one side at the expense of the other. For the king, this moment carries a weight that is both personal and institutional. He is not simply a monarch responding to a procedural issue, he is a grandfather faced with a direct appeal from within his own family. And yet, he is also the guardian of a structure that depends on consistency, on rules that apply not selectively, but universally. Balancing these roles is never simple. It requires careful judgment, restraint, and an awareness that any decision made in this moment will resonate far beyond it. Because within the monarchy, actions are rarely isolated. They ripple outward, influencing not only immediate outcomes, but future expectations. And that is what makes this situation so delicate. It is not just about addressing a concern, it is about defining how concerns like this will be handled moving forward. As the discussions continue behind closed doors, the tension does not dissipate, it evolves. It becomes quieter, more contained, but no less significant. Because everyone involved understands that the outcome will matter, not just for those directly affected, but for the institution as a whole. It will signal something about priorities, about fairness, about the balance between tradition and change. And until that signal is clear, the uncertainty remains. Lingering, unresolved, because in a system where every decision carries meaning, even silence can speak volumes. And at the center of it all stands a king already under immense pressure, forced to make a decision that could redefine more than just security. What started as a private request is now being seen by some insiders as a reflection of a much deeper divide, one that has been quietly shaping the royal family for years. Because beneath the carefully maintained image of unity, there has always existed a more complex reality, one defined not just by blood, but by role, responsibility, the unspoken hierarchy that determines how each member fits within the institution. Those who observe the monarchy closely often suggest that this divide is not new, it has simply remained unspoken, managed through tradition, and reinforced by expectation. Some are born into positions that demand visibility, duty, and constant accountability, while others, though equally connected by lineage, exist on the margins of that structure, close enough to feel its weight, yet distant enough to experience its limitations. And it is within this space that figures like Zara Tindall find themselves, navigating a reality that is neither fully inside nor entirely outside the system. For years, this balance has held, largely because it was understood, even if it was never openly discussed. Working royals carried the burden of public duty and, in return, received the full support of the institution. Non-working royals, on the other hand, were afforded greater personal freedom but operated with fewer formal protections. It was a trade-off, one that seemed stable on the surface, but as expectations evolve, as public attention intensifies, and as the lines between public and private life continue to blur, that balance begins to feel less certain. Because the world surrounding the monarchy is changing, and with it, the pressures placed upon those connected to it. Visibility is no longer confined to official roles, it extends to anyone associated with the crown, whether they seek it or not. And with that visibility comes risk that does not distinguish between titles or responsibilities. This is where the conversation becomes more complex. Because when concerns about security arise, they do not exist in isolation. They intersect with broader questions about fairness and hierarchy, about whether the existing system is still equipped to address the realities of modern royal life. Some insiders suggest that comparisons between different branches of the family have become more pronounced in recent years, not necessarily out of rivalry, but out of observation. Differences in treatment, in access, in protection, subtle distinctions that may have once gone unnoticed are now being viewed through a more critical lens. And once those differences are seen, they are difficult to ignore. They invite questions. They demand reflection. And in some cases, they lead to action. At the heart of this situation lies an ongoing tension between tradition and change. The monarchy has always relied on structure, on clearly defined roles that preserve order and continuity. But the expectations placed upon it are no longer static. They are evolving, shaped by a world that demands transparency, fairness, and adaptability. And within that evolving landscape, long-standing practices are being quietly reassessed. Not openly challenged, not dramatically overturned, but questioned in ways that signal a shift in perspective. Because what once felt acceptable may no longer feel sufficient. And what was once understood without explanation may now require justification. This is why the current situation carries such weight. It is not simply about one request or one decision, it is about what that request represents. A moment where unspoken tensions begin to surface, where private concerns reflect broader uncertainties within the institution itself. It suggests that the divide, long managed through silence and tradition, may no longer be as stable as it once appeared. And, perhaps most significantly, it raises the possibility that this is not an isolated concern. That others, observing the same patterns, experiencing the same uncertainties, may be quietly reaching similar conclusions. Because when one voice steps forward, it rarely stands alone. It echoes, it resonates, and it creates space for others to question what they may have once accepted without hesitation. Because if one voice has now been raised, it leaves a lingering question who else may be feeling the same. For King Charles III, this is more than a procedural issue, it is a deeply personal test of leadership. A moment where duty, family, and legacy collide in ways that cannot be easily separated. Because at the center of this unfolding situation stands not just a monarch bound by centuries of tradition, but a grandfather confronted with a direct and deeply personal appeal. And those who understand the weight of the crown often suggest that these are the moments that define a reign, not the public ceremonies or carefully orchestrated appearances, but the quiet decisions made under pressure, where there is no clear path forward, only consequences to be managed. For King Charles III, the challenge lies in navigating a system that demands consistency while responding to a situation that feels anything but ordinary. The monarchy has always relied on structure, on rules that are applied not selectively but uniformly, preserving a sense of order that extends beyond any single individual. It is this structure that gives the institution its stability, its continuity, its sense of permanence. And as its guardian, the king carries the responsibility of upholding it, even when doing so becomes uncomfortable. Because every decision he makes must reflect not only the needs of the present, but the expectations of the past and the implications for the future. Yet, within this framework, there exists a tension, one that becomes impossible to ignore when personal concerns intersect with institutional boundaries. When a request comes not as a matter of protocol, but as a matter of family, the lines begin to blur. And it is within that blurred space that the true complexity of this moment emerges. Reports suggest that the king has approached the situation with careful deliberation, resisting any immediate reaction, choosing instead to review, to listen, to consider. Those familiar with his approach often describe it as measured, almost cautious, a recognition that decisions made too quickly can carry unintended consequences. Because this is not simply about addressing a concern, it is about how that concern is addressed. The process itself matters. The precedent it sets matters. And within a system as intricate as the monarchy, even a single exception can ripple outward in ways that are difficult to contain. That is the risk. That is the weight of the decision. Because if one request leads to a shift in policy or practice, it opens the door to others. It creates a new expectation, one that may challenge the very structure the king is tasked with preserving. At the same time, the emotional dimension cannot be dismissed. Behind the layers of protocol and procedure lies a simple, undeniable truth. This is a family matter. It is about protection, about reassurance, about the instinct to respond when those closest to you express concern. And balancing that instinct with the demands of leadership is no easy task. It requires restraint, judgment, and, perhaps most difficult of all, the ability to accept that no decision will satisfy every expectation. Because whatever path is chosen, it will inevitably be interpreted not just within the palace, but beyond it. It will be seen as a statement, a reflection of priorities, a signal of how the monarchy chooses to navigate the tension between tradition and change. This is what gives the moment its gravity. It is not defined by urgency but by significance. A quiet crossroads where the personal and the institutional meet, where the outcome will shape not only the immediate situation, but the broader narrative of the monarchy itself. And as the king continues to weigh his options, the uncertainty remains, not as a sign of indecision, but as a reflection of the complexity he faces. Because in a system built on precedent, every choice becomes part of its history. And every decision carries with it a message about fairness, about responsibility, about the balance between duty and compassion. And whatever choice is made, it may not stay contained within palace walls for long. This moment may appear contained, but insiders suggest its impact could stretch far beyond a single request, quietly reshaping how the monarchy operates in the years ahead. Because what begins as a private concern rarely remains private when it touches the foundations of an institution built on precedent and perception. Those who follow the internal dynamics closely often suggest that moments like this act as catalysts, subtle at first, but powerful in their long-term effect. And in this case, the focus is already beginning to shift from the request itself to what it might change. At the center of that shift lies the question of policy, particularly how royal security is defined, distributed, and justified in a modern context. Because if concerns raised by Zara Tindall lead to even a slight reconsideration of existing arrangements, it could signal the beginning of a broader recalibration, one that extends beyond a single family branch and into the structure of the monarchy itself. There are suggestions that discussions have already begun, not publicly, not formally, but within the quiet channels where institutional adjustments are first explored. These conversations, according to those familiar with such processes, often focus on balance, how to maintain the integrity of long-standing rules while acknowledging the realities that no longer fit neatly within them. Because the distinction between working and non-working royals, once clearly defined, is now being tested by a world that does not always recognize those boundaries. Visibility has changed, exposure has increased, and with it the expectations surrounding protection have evolved. This creates a challenge that cannot be easily resolved, because any adjustment risks altering the very hierarchy that defines the system. Yet without adjustment, the system risks appearing outdated, disconnected from the realities it is meant to manage. The implications extend further still. Beyond internal discussions, there is the question of perception, how this situation is viewed by those outside the palace walls. Media attention, once focused on ceremonial duties and public appearances, has become a significant source of attention for the president, has increasingly turned toward the mechanics behind the monarchy, the decisions that shape it, the policies that sustain it. And moments like this invite scrutiny. They raise questions not just about what is happening, but why. Why are certain decisions made? Why do some individuals receive different levels of support? Why does the system operate as it does? These are not new questions, but they are being asked with greater intensity, and perhaps more importantly, with greater visibility. And as that scrutiny grows, so too does the pressure for clarity. Not necessarily full transparency, but enough to maintain trust in an institution that relies heavily on perception. For future generations, the stakes may be even higher, because the decisions made now will shape the expectations they inherit. If changes are introduced, even subtly, they become part of the new normal, redefining what it means to be protected within the royal framework. And if no changes are made, that too sends a message, one that may influence how those future members of the family view their place within the institution. It is this forward-looking dimension that gives the current moment its significance. It is not just about addressing a present concern, but also about addressing a concern that has been present for a long time, but about setting a direction for what comes next. A direction that must reconcile tradition with transformation, stability with adaptation. This is where the idea of modernization begins to emerge, not as a dramatic overhaul, but as a gradual shift. A recognition that long-standing practices may need to evolve in order to remain effective. And while such evolution is often resisted, it is also, at times, unavoidable. Because institutions that do not adapt risk becoming disconnected from the world they represent. And in the case of the monarchy, that connection is essential. It is what sustains relevance. It is what preserves legitimacy. And it is what ensures that the system continues to function not just as a symbol, but as a living structure capable of responding to change. Yet even as these possibilities take shape, even as the future begins to unfold in subtle and significant ways, the present remains unresolved. The questions raised have not yet been fully answered. Decisions that will define the outcome have not yet been made public. And in that space between uncertainty and resolution, the tension continues to build. Because while the future may be forming quietly behind closed doors, the impact of what is happening now is already being felt. And as that impact deepens, it brings everything back to a single, lingering question, one that refuses to fade, no matter how much time passes or how carefully it is managed. But even as the future begins to take shape, one question still lingers in the present. In the end, this isn't just about one request, one meeting, or even one decision. It's about what happens when the quiet rules of the monarchy are challenged from within. Because what Zara Tindall has done, whether viewed as necessary or disruptive, carries a significance that extends far beyond the immediate concern. It represents a moment where silence gave way to direct action, where a system built on discretion was met with a demand that could not be softened or redirected. And in doing so, it has forced a shift subtle but undeniable in how the institution confronts questions it once kept carefully contained. This is no longer just about security. It is about responsibility, about fairness, about whether the structures that define protection within the royal family still reflect the realities of those who live within its reach. Because when someone chooses to step forward, not publicly, not dramatically, but with quiet determination, it reveals something deeper than urgency. It reveals a belief that the system, as it stands, may no longer be enough. At its core, this moment exposes a tension that has always existed but rarely surfaced so clearly: the balance between tradition and change. The monarchy has long relied on its ability to preserve continuity, to maintain a sense of order that feels unshaken by time. Yet beneath that continuity lies a need to adapt, to respond to circumstances that evolve faster than structures designed to manage them. And this is where the challenge emerges, because adapting too quickly risks destabilizing the very foundation the institution depends on, while resisting change risks creating a disconnect that cannot be ignored. It is a delicate balance, one that requires not just careful decision-making, but a willingness to acknowledge that the world outside the palace gates is no longer static. It is watching, questioning, and, increasingly, expecting more. The uncertainty that now surrounds this situation only adds to its weight. No clear resolution has been made public. No definitive statement has settled the questions that have been raised. And in that absence, the story continues to evolve not through confirmed facts, but through interpretation, speculation, and the quiet analysis of those who follow these moments closely. Because uncertainty has a way of amplifying significance. It leaves space for questions to grow, for narratives to form, for meaning to be assigned even in the absence of clear answers. And within the monarchy, where every action carries symbolic value, that uncertainty becomes part of the story itself. It shapes how the moment is understood, how it is remembered, and how it influences what comes next. What makes this situation particularly powerful is the emotional undercurrent that runs beneath it. This is not a distant political issue or an abstract institutional debate. It is personal. It is about family, about protection, about the instinct to ensure that those closest to you are safe. And when that instinct meets a system that cannot immediately provide reassurance, it creates a conflict that is both deeply human and profoundly complex. Because no matter how structured the institution may be, it is still made up of individuals, each carrying their own concerns, their own expectations, their own limits. And when those limits are reached, something has to give, whether it is the system, the expectation, or silence that once held everything in place. As the dust settles, or perhaps as it continues to rise in quieter, less visible ways, one question remains at the center of it all. Not just for those within the palace, but for those observing from the outside, trying to understand what this moment truly represents. Who does the system ultimately serve? Is it designed to protect equally, or does it reflect a hierarchy that cannot fully adapt to changing realities? These are not simple questions, and they do not demand immediate answers, but they linger, they persist, and they shape the way this moment will be remembered long after the details have faded. Because in a world defined by tradition and silence, even a single demand can echo far louder than anyone ever expected. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.